I'm talking today about one of the fundamental principles of my practice, which is with a proper combination of careful case selection, exquisite preparation, and knowing the medicine as well or maybe better than the defendant doctor. The goal of every defendant's deposition is to prove your case through the defendant's own mouth. And if you follow some of the principles I'm going to be talking about, it's surprising how often that occurs, which obviously has a beneficial effect in terms of your likelihood of success at trial, or educating the defendant so that you increase the likelihood of a settlement. One of the things that is a core value of mine is to understand the medicine as well as the defendant does. He or she is the one who made the mistake. And so you really need to prove to the defendant how and why the mistake was made in order to get them to confess. It is not adequate to just send a pile of records to an expert and say, here, what do you think of this? Rather, you need to read the literature yourself, hopefully even have met with your expert and gone over things so that in terms of the deposition, you're able to challenge the testimony of the witness, keeping in mind that there can be several purposes of the deposition. The principal purpose is to establish through the mouth of the defendant that he or she knew what the standard of care was and what the standard of care was, and then to confront the witness with what actually happened in order to establish through his or her own mouth a violation of that standard of care. Of course, there are other purposes as well. You want to learn the facts, but you don't want the witness just sort of vomiting their version of what happened or their justification for what happened. So if you understand the medical issues, then you're going to be able to confront them and challenge them as you go through and hopefully persuade them of the rightness of your point of view. Think about, in terms of the form of your question, how would that sound when it's read back at trial? You want it to sound like an admission. So you phrase the question, confront the doctor with it, and basically you're asking them to agree with a fundamental proposition when you're talking about standard of care. I often say at trial you want to talk like a person because you're persuading jurors. At a deposition you want to talk like a doctor because if you confront the defendant with these fundamental medical principles, they're more likely to have to agree with you than if you're sort of stumbling or bumbling around. The first clip has to do with a little girl who had what's called a ventricular peritoneal shunt. Because she had hydrocephalus and it helps take the excess fluid from the brain, and it malfunctioned and there was a failure to diagnose that. What you will see is what I call the differential diagnosis drill. And in every case involving a failure to diagnose something, again, there are fundamental principles that every physician will agree to. That when you have a new patient and you have certain symptoms, you need to think about the possible causes of the symptoms, and then you need to take those steps necessary to rule in or rule out, and what are those symptoms, what are those tests, et cetera.
Whatever the age group, in any patient with a shunt, there can be a malfunction that requires attention.
Yes.
That's something that the neurosurgeon needs to keep in mind for any patient with a shunt, then. Is that fair?
Yes.
That it can malfunction?
Yes.
What are those risks?
Well, if the shunt doesn't function and the patient depends on the shunt, they will develop increased hydrocephalus.
That can cause increased intracranial pressure?
It could cause increased intracranial pressure. It could cause brain dysfunction too.
Either as a function of the hydrocephalus or increased intracranial pressure, brain damage can occur where the shunt malfunctions?
It could.
And where the shunt malfunction is not attended to, the patient can even die, right?
That's possible.
You may notice the way that the questions are phrased. In the early part of the deposition where I'm trying to establish the standard of care, the questions are never you. It's never what did you do, what did you think. It's all about what the physician should do, what tests were available, because then what you do is you establish what the physician should know, should have available, should do. And then when you circle around and come back to the facts of your particular case, then you confront the defendant with the prior testimony, because he has either failed to have the knowledge, failed to take the steps, or otherwise failed to comply with the standard of care.
Actually, let me back up for a minute. Are you familiar with the term differential diagnosis?
From day one of medical school.
Okay, that's something that a neurosurgeon does day in and day out in his practice. Is that fair?
Neurosurgeons and doctors in general.
Okay.
That's what we do.
And in terms of the differential diagnosis, does that mean that the physician needs to think about possible causes for a patient's clinical presentation?
Yes.
And then he needs to take those steps necessary to rule in or rule out those possibilities?
Yes.
It's particularly important for the neurosurgeon to do a differential when one or more of the diagnoses he's considering could potentially cause brain damage or even death to the patient, right?
Yes.
If there's, shall we say, a high index of suspicion for a shunt malfunction, the neurosurgeon wouldn't wait around to have a radionucleide study done to confirm that, right?
That's correct. If you feel that the patient life is at a risk, you're not going to sit around waiting for a shunt study to do whatever you need to do.
Okay, and so you would proceed with either a different diagnostic study or directly to treatment of the patient if there's a high index of suspicion of a shunt malfunction.
Correct.
That was important because this little girl was in the hospital on a Sunday, and they had ordered the radionuclide study to take place on Monday, thereby resulting in her death on Sunday. Thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the program.